Hello, welcome to Growing Hybrid Tea Roses in Kentucky. This is our second online class since the pandemic has hit. We'll be doing these from now on until further notice. Also, this will be loaded onto our YouTube site so you can go back at a later date and watch it again. First off, a little history of roses. The first fossil record dates back 35 million years to what is today Iraq, Colorado, Montana, and Oregon. About 3000 BC, this is the first written record of the rose by the Sumerians. And in nature, the genus Rosa has more than 150 species, and they spread all over the northern hemisphere. There are no native roses in the southern hemisphere. Garden cultivation of roses started in China more than 5,000 years ago, and that is where we get some of the genetic diversity that helped us mix with the North American roses to get the new hybrids that are on the market these days. During the reign of the Roman Empire, rose popularity increased in the Middle East, and the Romans used the roses for confetti, medicinal purposes, perfume, and for large public gardens. You can imagine perfumes were really important in those days, especially when they had crowds of people, because of there just wasn't a lot of bathing or options for bathing back then, and was it deodorants and things. So I'm sure that the perfume of the roses were very popular. During the 15th century, roses were used in England as a symbol of fighting factions, and this is where we get the proverbial War of the Roses. White was for York, and red was for Lancaster. This became known as obviously the War of the Roses. Napoleon's wife Josephine established extensive rose gardens near Paris in the 1800s. It's probably whenever the popularity of roses really took off worldwide. Where Pierre Joseph Rudetez, and I'll apologize for my French because I don't speak French. That's the closest I can get to it after listening to that online. Anyway, his illustrations arose and made the roses a lot more popular. And you can see here on the next slide that this is one of Rudet's uh, paintings or portraits of a rose, and they're very popular and very pretty, and they still are today. There are about 35 rose species indigenous to North America. There's the Rosa virginiana, Rosa carolina, and Rosa californica. That's just to name a few. You can guess by those second parts of their names what states that they were originally found in. Captain John Smith wrote that the Indians of the James River Valley planted wild roses around their villages for beauty. I would think in those times they probably planted the roses. As anyone that's been around wild roses knows how huge and prolific and how thorny they are. I'm sure they also planted those for some protection from wild animals and things as well. Rose species from North America were taken to Europe and used in hybridizing. There was a limited gene pool of European roses because there wasn't very many wild types in Europe. So whenever the North America rose varieties were taken over, they mixed quite well and increased the gene pool. Then in the late 1800s, cultivated roses from China were introduced to Europe. And that's where most of our modern day roses can be traced back to this ancestry, is where basically the three gene pools came together and created what we have today as our modern roses. A little more history of the roses. The modern rose hybrids date back to 1867. That was whenever our hybrid teas were starting to come on the market, and the grandiflors and the others that we'll talk about a little bit in the future. But by 1920, the hybrid teas dominated the market, and they're still the most popular today. For cut flowers, they're the long stem roses that you are familiar with at the florists. The All-American Rose Selections formed in 1938 that test new rose varieties. They still test the new rose varieties, and they still have the All-American Rose Selection winners every year. During World War II, one of the most popular roses in the world was smuggled from occupied France. It's the peace rose that's there in the picture. My grandmother loved that rose, and a lot of people do. It still grows very well here. It's got a beautiful flower on it. And thank God they did smuggle it out of France during World War II before it was lost to us. As far as site selection goes, you do need full sun. That's about 6 hours. 5 hours will probably be okay as well. You need good air circulation. That's for disease protection. You need well-drained soils and high organic matter. Roses do not like wet soils, but they also don't like to be in too dry soils. Morning sun is important because that dries the leaves. And also some shade in the afternoon can be beneficial, especially in the heat of the summer. As far as soil goes, you do need to get a soil test. In extension, we're always going to recommend you get a soil test. But roses are tolerant of most soil types. However, the more organic matter, the better. These are heavy feeders because they're constantly producing blooms. Before planting, you need to work in 2 to 4 inches of organic matter. Aged manure, compost, anything like that is fine. Cow manure works great. They actually respond quite well to that. If you've had horse manure or something like that, it'd be great as well. Soil pH should be between 6 and 7. Usually our native pH is around in between those two, which is pretty good. And then your soil amendments need to be made prior to planting. You can't get that organic matter down to those root systems after they're planted, so you need to work it in ahead of time. So as far as where do you get your roses, you can purchase roses from garden centers, retail outlets, or by mail. Local garden centers and nurseries offer convenience. You can just go pick them up whenever you're ready. However, usually your selection is going to be limited. And if there's particular colors and varieties that you want, you're almost going to have to always order those. They give you the widest selection, the widest cultivars, the newest up-to-date plants are usually going to be mail order only. Nurseries and garden centers generally sell roses in containers or in bloom, which is fine. One thing to look for on these is you do want to purchase roses that have deep green leaves that cover the stems, a lot of healthy new growth, few fully developed flowers. You just want them in bud, just forming buds. That's the best. And you don't want to buy plants with yellow or brown leaves. That means they've been stressed. Leaves with black or rust-colored spots or powdery mildew or powdery substance on the leaves, because that is a disease and you do not want to take that home and start that right off on those new roses. And then try not to plant purchase flowers and roses in full flower, because that, you're not getting to enjoy that first full flush of flowers then. So if you buy them in bud, you'll get to enjoy that longer. Or if the plants look stressed at all, just leave them there and move on and buy some that look better somewhere else. Roses are sold in 3 grades. Usually number 1 canes are about 3/4 inch in diameter and have no more than 3 to 4 inch is of between the graft union and the top of the roots. You can see that in that slide there. The first picture there is a bigger rose. It's a number 1 grade. That's usually what you're going to get mail order. They have well-developed root systems. They have to be 2 years old, so you know that they've put on some growth. They generally are going to be the largest and most expensive plants, but also going to be the ones that you're going to get have the best luck of being successful with. You can also get number 1.5 grade roses. They're usually have 2 strong canes, and they'll catch up to grade 1 rose pretty quickly. However, you're still going to be maybe a year behind that one because it is usually a smaller plant. And then you have the grade 2 roses, which we consider the cheap roses, very small canes. A lot of times they're a substandard, and many of these will never grow and catch up and grow into a nice bush. So for the most part, I'm going to try to get number 1 grade roses if I'm going to buy them for myself. If push comes to shove, I'll buy number 1.5 grade as well. But the number 2s, no, wouldn't even consider those. So we also have budded or own root roses. You can see in the graph there, they have on the left there, that's the grafted rose, and on the right there, there's own root rose. Budded roses that have been grafted, they've been grafted to a rootstock, and you can see there, there's a little union there where the canes meet. There's a little round area there, that's where it's joined to the rootstock. Own root roses are just that. They're just rooted cuttings, and they grow into a bush. And then nurseries like the budded roses because production time is reduced, and the wild rootstock is more vigorous than root systems of modern roses. So those plants take off a lot faster, and they're a lot quicker to get on the market. So why is the bud union important? First of all, that bud union is the graft point where the variety of rose that you want to grow is grafted to a rootstock, which is usually a wild species. You can see it in that the photo there. There's their little round area there with the bud union, and that's where it joins the rootstock. One thing you have to keep in mind is when you grow budded roses is you have to make sure that bud union does not freeze out. You have to keep that covered in the winter, or if it does freeze out, your plant will come back, but it's going to come back from the root system, and it's going to be a wild rose. And she's going to be one of those that's a dark red burgundy color, but it only blooms 1 time in the spring, and it's very susceptible to powdery mildew, and it just does not make a nice shrub. The advantages of bedded roses is they may be the only option if in commercial production. Some of the roses simply can't be rooted or don't grow well on their own root systems. So if you like a particular variety, it may be that it can only come on the market as a budded rose because it just doesn't grow into a nice shrub on its own root systems. It's just not a prolific root system. And also, it may be the only way to maintain a cultivar if it's one of those cultivars that just doesn't grow well in its own root system. Some of the disadvantages of budded roses is they do send up suckers sometimes from the root systems, but you can just pull those out. They generally look nothing like the plant that you're wanting to grow at the top. The bud union, again, can freeze out, so that's a big thing, is making sure that you cover that in the wintertime to make sure it doesn't freeze out. And then the graft incompatibility can occur. That's not very common. Usually that's tested through as they're hybridizing these and they grow them for a few years and they know that the two varieties will grow together at the same rate. Also, rose mosaic variety viruses can spread through budding. Generally speaking, if it's a reputable hybridizer or garden center, that's not going to be an issue because they test for those kinds of things. Some advantages of on-root roses. There's no off-type suckers, so whatever comes up from the root system will be the same rose as what you're wanting to grow. They do tend to be longer lived, again, because they don't have a bud union that you have to worry about getting froze out. There's no bud union to protect, so if these freeze down to the ground, they're going to come back from their own root system. They're just more durable that way because they're on their own root system. Some of the disadvantages is they may be a slower grower just because their root system is not as prolific as the wild root stock it would have been grafted to. And it may be smaller and less robust than a budded rose. So those are things to consider. For the most part, I will take a on root rose or a budded rose, depends on the situation and what the varieties are. If the variety grows just as well on its own root as it would budded, then I would choose on root. But a lot of these new hybrid teas and hybrid teas in general do grow much better and do produce a much nicer plant as a budded plant. As far as purchasing, you can get roses at retail outlets. Sometimes you get them like this in a rose that's sold in a bag. If you purchase these, don't buy roses that have long shoots or already starting to grow. They need to be dormant or almost dormant to really be successful with these because these are packed in sawdust. So you want to get these out. Basically, this is them selling a bare root rose at a garden center with something on the root system just to keep from drying out. So if they've got canes and stuff on them, they're going to be already starting to grow. And when you try to plant them and spread those root systems out to plant them, you're going to stress the plant and you got a high chance of it dying. So if you do buy these, buy them really early in the season, say late February, and get them in the ground as soon as possible. Also, some of these will have wax on the stems, and that wax is just to keep them from drying out while they're sitting in the garden center waiting to be sold. That's not going to hurt a thing. Once they get planted, the new buds will break right through that wax and grow, and they'll be just fine. Mail order companies sell roses bare root. This is a bare root rose here. This is what you're going to get here in the class. These roses will be dormant when you receive them. They may or may not be packed with moist wood shavings or peat. A lot of times these days they don't pack the extra shavings and peat and things in there just because it adds to the weight and adds to the shipping cost. Again, the cane should be plump, smooth, and unshriveled. If anything, if they're dried out or shriveled or whatever, you need to make sure you call the garden center or the mail order place and either let them know that if they die, that they arrive with you in bad shape or that you want to get a replacement. As far as planting roses, we have potted roses and we have bare root roses we have to think about planting. As far as container grown roses, you do want to make sure you water them well before trying to plant them. You never want to put any root ball in the ground dry, so make sure you water that root ball and get it nice and wet before you try to plant it. You probably need to turn the pot on the side or the plant on the side and gently tap the root system to kind of pull that root ball out. If the root ball doesn't come out easily, you can just snip that plastic pot right off with some clippers. Another thing is try not to get that or let that root ball fall apart. You need to keep that in a nice as root ball as you can get, because if it's actively growing and that root ball falls apart, you're going to get transplant shock and you're going to have a much higher chance of your rose actually dying. Once roses are actively growing, they do not want to be upset. Make sure to plant the proper depth, generally at the level that's grown in the pot. For the most part, sometimes they may be sticking up a little bit higher than the soil surface of the pot, so you may want to bury it just a little bit deeper than it was already growing in the container. After filling in around the root ball with soil, you can water them in thoroughly, and then spacing will depend on the type of the roses. Generally, 2 or 3 feet around between hybrid teas is generally enough. Bare root and bagged roses. I consider bagged roses bare root roses because they're packed in sawdust, and you've got to get those out of that bag and pull those root systems apart and get them planted. So you want to unpack both types from the peat or the shavings. Place the whole plant or just the root area in water and soak for 8 to 12 hours. If you think there's a fungus in there, you can put a fungicide. I've never done it. Don't really see the point in it because these are dormant and they're going to be bare root. You're going to soak them, so most of any of those spores, if they're still on there, are going to be washed away with that. So you want to make sure you rehydrate them because they may be a little dry upon arrival to you. After soaking, you want to trim off any broken roots or stems. Generally speaking, most of these bare root roses are shipped already pruned back and the roots already pruned. Don't worry about that. But if anything's broke, go ahead and trim that out. You want to maintain 3 to 5 canes per plant. Again, that's usually what they're going to be shipped as. And then 3 to 5 buds per stem, which is again usually what they're shipped as. The buds are the little red raised areas on spots on the canes. That'll tell you where the new canes are going to come out. Now, if you're growing some of these bagged roses, some of those sometimes will come with the canes tied together. You're going to want to clip that string, and you're going to want to cut below that string because a lot of those strings cut into those stems, and that just creates a problem later on if that plant does grow from above that. So they do grow these a little bit longer so they can tie them up, so they're going to need to be trimmed down below that stem. Back to that 3 to 5 canes per plant and 3 to 5 buds per stem. Bare root plants, you have to plant those a little different than you do the root ball plants. You want to dig the hole wide enough and deep enough to fit the rose roots in comfortably. You should not have to bend the roots into the hole or any kind of, you want the roots to have plenty of room to spread out, and they should be laying out comfortably, not squished in there or bent around to make them fit into the hole. As far as one thing you do want to make sure you do to be successful with these bare root plants is make sure that you put a cone of soil in the bottom of that hole that will fit up under that root system and get the soil contact where those roots are joining that stem, because a lot of times if you don't put a cone of soil under there, you'll get a little dry pocket under there, and then your plant will dry out and it'll die. So just gently spread the roots out over that cone, fill the hole about 2/3 full of soil, and then add water and let that water saturate that area. That way that water will make sure that soil gets in there next to that root system, and also it will force any air bubbles out, which will help keep that from forming that dry slot under there. Also, you want to when the water drains, you want to finish filling in around the plant thoroughly. In Kentucky, that bud union should be right at ground level or slightly below. I've had it slightly up, slightly about halfway, and slightly below. I like to have it right at ground level for my best. I've had the best success with hybrid tea roses with it right even with ground level. So you do want to worry about cold weather. If you plant some of these really early, say late February, early March, you still may want to go ahead and put some soil or mulch over that bud unions just in case we have a cold spell. A cold spell, I'm meaning down like single digits. With these plants, if they've been sitting in cold storage, they may not have dormancy all the way down to what they would need to go through a 0-degree day or something like that. So go ahead and put some mulch or soil over that if you plant these. If you get the bagged roses in late February and you do get them in the ground then, which you should if you can buy them then, just make sure you protect that bud union, because that's what you've got to protect to keep that rose variety as what you want it. As far as watering, roses, like most other plants, require about 1 inch of water per week. If it's a hot, dry period, like back when we had last summer and fall, then you may need 1.5 inches per week. So just make sure you keep that in mind. If you have sandy soils, obviously you're going to have more water than that. Most of us around here don't have sandy soils. We have clay soils, which do hold water, which is good for growing roses if you've added organic matter to that. I like to use soaker hoses because soaker hoses saturate the ground right where you lay the hose, and you don't waste a lot of water from evaporation, and you don't get the leaves wet, which we'll talk about diseases later. And the less wetness of leaves that you have, the better chance you've got of having less fungal pathogens. Mulch. It's good to keep mulch on your roses. It keeps the soil cool. It reduces your weed growth, which is another problem that's going to take moisture out of your soil. It does conserve moisture, which is a big deal, especially in the summer around here. Also, it helps control diseases because it stops that splashing of soil up on the leaves. 2 to 3 inches generally enough. You can use whatever mulch that you like: wood chips, straw, dry grass, clippings, shredded bark, even stone if you like. I don't really prefer the stone for a couple of reasons. They heat up really quickly, and then you still get weeds that come back in there, and I just like the look of mulch better. Organic mulches use nitrogen as they decompose. So if you use something like sawdust that's not decomposed some already, that can actually pull some nitrogen out of your soil as it's decomposing before it returns it back. So you may have to add a little more urea or nitrogen to that bed to make sure that that doesn't happen. Fertilizing your roses, always follow your soil test. Obviously, that's going to be your big thing. Um, to maintain beautiful roses, you need a good fertility program. Most of the species roses, they only need to be fertilized in the spring. We're not going to talk about them right now because we're worried about our hybrid teas. So we're going to go to the next slide and talk. As far as fertilizing our continuous flowering roses or hybrid teas, you need about a half to 1 cup of multi-purpose fertilizer, or especially rose fertilizer. You can use triple 19, triple 10, or you can buy the more expensive actual rose fertilizers, and I've not really seen much difference in them. Anyway, around April 15th, you want to apply that half to 1 cup per bush. June the 15th, and again August the 15th. You don't want to apply any fertilizer after August the 15th because you don't want this plant growing new, lush, succulent growth up into October when we can have some cold weather, it kill it back, and you want these plants to go into dormancy. So you kind of want them to harden off before we have that really cold weather. So try not to push them after that August 15th date. Time release fertilizers such as Osmocote can be applied in May as well. They do have 4, 6, and 8 month formulas, but they do not last that long around here. Usually about a half a cup per bush is what you're going to apply. But they release their nutrients faster in the warmer, the rainier the weather. So if we have dry weather, they're not releasing the nutrients as much. If we have a lot of rain and a lot of warm weather, then they're going to release a lot faster. So keep in mind, you still might have to put some more of that on there more than just once every few months. Weed control, you do want to make sure that you do get some mulch down. That's going to be your best friend in a lot of areas with growing these roses. Hand weeding works if need be. You can also use mechanical tools like hoes and those kinds of things. These are shallow rooted plants, so you want to watch not dig too deep. Also, there's some reasons I don't want to use a lot of mechanical things around these roses. We'll talk about a disease that actually can move that around or start that for you if you do nick the roses. Preen is another thing that really is good. It'll stop small seeded weeds. So right after you plant these, it's good to put that preen down. You can stop a lot of that weeds from germinating before that, and then put a layer of mulch over it. And that'll pretty much take care of most of the things that are going to germinate, or the annual weeds. Some perennial weeds might come up if you have some root systems and stuff in there, though. So as far as pests go, black spot is our worst problem in roses around here. It's the most common, the most destructive disease that we have. And you can see in the picture there, it starts out with these black tar spot looking masses on the leaves, and then the leaflets turn yellow and drop off. It can cause complete defoliation, so you do want to make sure you take care of that and don't let it get too bad because you don't want the plants to get defoliated. They also can cause some dieback and some cankers if we have a really severe infection. So you want to make sure you do try to control that before it gets to that point. So once those leaves fall to the ground, you do want to make sure you rake those up because that's a reservoir for more spores later or even in the next year or two. If you do have stems that are infected, you do want to trim those out. Those yellow leaves that fall off prematurely, again, get those up. Trim off any purplish spots or on the stems because that's, again, another reservoir for those. Splashing water does spread this disease and does increase infestation. That's why I talked about the soaker hoses earlier. If you do need to water these, then you want to make sure you don't get the leaves wet, and soaker hoses does a good job with that. Infection occurs after leaves have been wet for several hours. So if you put these in an area where we get morning sun and we get good airflow and you water from the bottom and not the top and put a good mulch down, you're going to lessen your chances of this disease. So those are things you really need to do. And that fungus does overwinter in fallen leaves and stem canker, so get those out of there. Here's what a stem canker looks like in those pictures there. If you can, select varieties that are resistant to black spot. Most of our hybrid teas are not going to be real resistant, but some of them are better than others. Again, rake and discard those fallen leaves, prune out any stem cankers, avoid wetting the leaves, locate the plant in full sun with good air circulation. I've talked about this more than once now, but these are the keys to controlling this disease, which is the most destructive in your roses. Also, keep your mulch down and then maintain your fungicide program. And by fungicide program, we're going to need to spray maybe once every week to 10 days if we've had weather that is conducive for these diseases, which is usually rainy, warm weather. We have powdery mildew is another pest on these, and you can see by the picture there, it just forms this cottony white mold on the leaves. The leaves will curl and twist, and maybe even purple. It does prefer new foliage because it's a nice, more succulent foliage for it to infect. Um, Mature leaves are less likely to be infected, so that's a good thing that you have to more concentrate your sprays on the new growth instead of the older growth. This one is spread by wind and is worse when warm, humid days are followed by cool nights. It doesn't necessarily need free-flowing water on the leaves to infest like the black spot does. If you do have powdery mildew, you can prune out all diseased or dead or dying stems or canes. That's just a general purpose thing that we do for any kind of disease. Do use a spray program. Keep your rose petals picked up as another one, so when you deadhead, don't just throw them in the bed. Put them in something and get them out of there and take them to the compost pile away from the rose garden. Make sure to cover your young leaves with your spray thoroughly because that's where they're most acceptable. Plant roses in areas where they receive a good air circulation. This is the same thing for all diseases. Rapid drying of the foliage, good air circulation, and then don't get the leaves wet. Those are the main things. And also, purchase-resistant cultivars. This is one of those diseases you'll see a big difference in different cultivars in resistance to these. So some cultivars hardly ever get powdery mildew, and some are very susceptible and get them year after year after year. A few other diseases. We have botrytis blight, which is a fungal disease that generally attacks dying tissue or dead tissue. It can attack living tissue, but hardly ever does in the garden outside. Under wet conditions, it will attack living tissues, but that's more of a greenhouse issue then. But in our gardens, it's usually going to be the rose petals when they're dying, or the dying of the stems, those kinds of things whenever this is really going to set in. And it looks like a gray fuzzy mold, and you can see it in those pictures there. The easiest way to control this one is good garden sanitation. That's usually going to be adequate to get that stuff out of there. Deadhead your roses regularly, get those petals out, and anything that's diseased or dead, go ahead and trim it out and get rid of it. There are fungicides out there for it, but hardly ever is that going to be needed in our area. Another disease pest, or not really a disease, well, it is a disease, it's a virus. This is mosaic. And what it does is cause these yellow patterns in your leaves. It's infected plants, can't be cured, so once this virus is in your plant, it's in it forever. You can plant resistant varieties for these. This can be spread by aphids and by pruners, but most of the time it's spread by pruners in our gardens. If you have a rose with this disease or this virus, it's probably not going to die. It might not grow as well as other ones do, but you do want to make sure that you don't move this around your garden to other roses. So if you do want to keep one of these in your garden, if you've got one that's got this virus, make sure that you dip your clippers in bleach between pruning this one and pruning the other ones. And you really should do that anyway for a lot of reasons on some of these diseases. Mosaic is usually not fatal. However, it does reduce vigor and appearance. So that's something you need to keep in mind. This is another disease that I was talking about not using your mechanical means to hoe your garden, weed your garden. This is crown gall. It's a bacterial disease that can survive 15 to 20 years in the soil. So this is in soils everywhere. Infected plants will develop these galls that look like more of like a swelling or a cancer. These galls can actually girdle the plant and kill it. The plants will become stunted and fail to grow properly, especially if it gets into that bud union. The disease is spread by wounds, so whenever you nick a rose while you're hoeing and you get some infected soil in that wound, then that's whenever you start to get these galls. So avoid cultivating close to your roses. You want to maintain good water and fertilization program if a plant has this. Also, if a plant has it badly, you want to remove and destroy that plant by burning it, and maybe not plant a rose back there for at least 5 years. Rose rosette is one of those diseases that's been around for a while. It wasn't very common until we started planting knockout roses everywhere. And as you would expect, as you plant more roses around, some diseases are going to pop up more often than they used to. But this disease is caused by a mite, and it's a toxin from the mite which gets in the plant. It's in the plant. It causes deformed growth, thick stems, thick blooms that really never open up properly. It's kind of a witch's broom look to the top of the plant, distorted leaves, distorted color. Basically, what happens is the plant just grows crazily, and then it loses its cold hardiness and they'll eventually just die out over a few years. Um, you'll see this, especially where they planted knockouts in towns, and they trimmed all the rows at the same time with the same pruners, and they just spread it to every plant. The mites are not that common, so you don't see it that often naturally. Um, I mean, you do see it, but humans have what really have spread this disease from that toxin. So you want to maintain good hygiene in your garden. So wash your clippers between each trimming each shrub or deadheading. And if you do get a plant that's got this, just go ahead and dig it out and get rid of it. And then don't put a plant back there for 3 to 5 years, so that toxin can be in the old roots and things that are there. And if you nick the new plant when you put it in and that's laying there next to that, you could still transport that. There is a chance that the mite that caused that is still in your garden or still in your area if it wasn't one uh, but it's not that common. So just keep in mind that this may show up, and if it does show up, then you'll just take that plant out and not put a plant back there for a few years. Aphids are a very common insect pest on roses and a lot of everything else in your garden. They're soft bite. They come in red, yellow, green, or black, even neon. They do prefer to feed on soft, succulent growth, new growths where you usually see them. You can knock these off if they're big quantities, just smash them with your fingers. If there's too many to do that, you can always wash them off the water hose and knock them back and kind of reduce their overall reproduction. Control methods usually are going to be something like insecticidal soaps, strong water sprays, insecticides. We'll talk about insecticides for some of these pests in a bit. Also, Japanese beetles. These are hard-shelled metallic green, black, and gold. You'll see these on everything. You've got them in your garden now, or not now, but every summer. They do have a voracious appetite, so they congregate in large masses. Is the reason they do so much damage. They'll eat leaves, they'll eat buds, they'll eat the flowers. They're difficult to control while they're out for that month or so, or 6 weeks there in the summer, because of all the things that they eat. 7 works the best by killing them. But if they're in flower, you can't spray the flowers, and they're going to get those flowers daily. So for my part, I go out there and cut the flower buds when they get ready to open and bring them in the house and enjoy them in the house. And then just keep the foliage sprayed. That way the Japanese beetles can't destroy the plant completely. Then we have leafcutter bees. You'll see these on your roses periodically. This is not really something I consider a pest. It is a native pollinator, which is a good thing. It's a solitary bee, and it cuts those little circles of leaves out and rolls it up and puts an egg inside and sticks it down in a little hole. And they hatch out the next year, and they'll eat their way through that. They does cut these perfect little round semicircular holes. There's no reason to try to control these. There's no reason to spray for these. This damage is simply cosmetic. It makes the leaves look a little bit ratty, but it's not affecting the plant enough to hurt its photosynthetic ability. So there's no reason to spray this. We want to maintain our native pollinators as best we can. So it's best to just go ahead and leave them alone and let them have a few of your leaflets and take care of the pollinators. Spider mites is another one of those pests that show up periodically, especially in hot, dry years. They are tiny relatives to the spider, so they're technically not an insect. They come in red, black, or brown. The two-spotted is usually the one that we have around here. They do pierce the undersides of the leaves, and they drink the chlorophyll out of the leaf. That leaves that bronzing color to the leaves. They do form fine webs in heavy infestations and covers all the leaflets. They do flourish in crowded gardens in hot, dry weather, especially if planted against a south or west facing wall where we don't get good airflow and don't get good rain penetration, where that plant gets a lot of water. The leaves get from beating rains. Rains will knock off these pests and kind of knock their numbers down. They can be difficult to control. Usually, a rose, in response to having a heavy infestation, will just drop its leaves to kind of get rid of them. You can try high pressure water sprays 3 days in a row. You spray up through the leaves, through the canopy of the foliage, and make sure you get under the leaves pretty good. And do that 3 days in a row, and then you can spray one of these insecticides. A lot of insecticides don't work well. You can try insecticidal soaps, dormant oil sprays during the winter, or even horticultural oil in the growing season. Make sure following the label directions. One thing you do want to do is make sure you clean up the leaf debris in the fall, because those eggs can overwinter and they rehatch and then they reinfest your plants. Thrips, this is more of a pest for people that want to show roses. They have these little mouth parts that scrape the buds and causes some deformity on the buds, and also especially for white or yellow roses, it gives these little specks of pink to the rose, and for show quality that's not good. For the most part around here, there's no need to have to spray them. Um, Tend to be worse in June, July, and August, those hot weather. And you can control these by insecticidal soaps and insecticides such as orthine. They're really not a huge pest for our area in the summer, unless you're wanting to show roses. And for show roses, you have to have perfect roses, and this pretty much will make sure you don't have a perfect rose. For black spot control, you're going to need a few fungicides to keep in your arsenal. Something like Daconil, which has chlorothalonil in it. Chlorothalonil is in a lot of fungicides sold these days. You can try Phyton 27 if you can find it, and also Mancozeb. Mancozeb and Daconil sold around here quite a bit. Those are both protectant fungicides, which you need to keep on the leaves to keep it kind of kills the spores. And then you have Funginex, which is out. It's for roses. We have Orthonex is for roses. I think Orthonex has a fungicide and insecticide mixed together. Immunox is one of our better ones, which I definitely think that you should definitely put that one in your arsenal. If I had to pick three there, I would take Bannermax, Immunox, and Daconil or Mancozeb, one or the other. Another one for powdery mildew is you need Captan, or you can try chlorothalonil with that one too. Phyton 27, Funginex, Orthonex, and Immunox. And you can see Immunox there is good for 2 or 3 of these, so it's good to keep, and it is systemic, but you cannot control or just rely on one fungicide to control these things. So you got to make sure you have a couple sprays of different things, because you don't want to set up where a system where you have, or you're developing a fungus that's resistant to your controls. Also for botrytis, you can try Captan or Daconil or Mancozeb for that as well. Again, botrytis is one of those you're probably not going to have to worry much about as long as you keep the dead material up out of your garden. The insecticides that you probably are going to want to need for Japanese beetle control, obviously Savin is going to be your one that's going to do your best on that one. I failed to mention the Savin during talking about the spider mites, but if you have a high spider mite population, you do want to avoid using Savin, even if you need Japanese beetles controlled, because it will spike your spider mite population and make them worse. So if you don't have spider mite, Savin's great. But if you have a high spider mite population, you may want to try something else like malathion or orthine or something to kind of ward off the Japanese beetles, even though Savin still gives you the best control for those. For spider mites, they're really hard to control once they have a large population built up, but you can try malathion, even though it's labeled, it'll knock them down some. Orthine, Orthonex, horticultural oils mechanically kills them, and so does insecticidal soaps. It basically just makes them, covers their bodies and they can't breathe. If you've got a lot of roses and you've got a lot of spider mites, you're going to have to go ahead and invest in an actual miticide. There's several of those on the market. There's Avit is the one here. It's probably a little cheaper than some of the other ones now because it's been on the market a while. Floramite is another one. And the reason these are so expensive is because you have to buy them in like quarts, and these quarts you use like a quarter of a teaspoon to a gallon of water. So they're very expensive, but they go a long way. So if you've got a friend or somebody that could share that chemical with you, then you may want to go in together with someone. Thrips, you can control those fairly easily with malathion. Insecticidal soaps help. Orthine will take care of them, and Orthonex and horticultural oils. And most of these insecticides will control most insect infestations you may get on roses, but generally there's just 2 or 3 major ones that you really are going to have to worry about. As far as deadheading your roses, you want to make sure you cut off any dead blooms after the petals fall, and get those petals out of there. Deadheading will enhance new growth and it'll help get more flowers, which is the reason you're growing hybrid teas to start with. If you do deadhead a rose, or when you do deadhead, make sure you cut that stem back to just above the a leaf with 5 leaflets. That way, whenever that breaks, that'll give you stems with 5 leaflets on it. A lot of these roses, if you cut them back only to the 3rd leaflet, the new shoots will only have 3 leaflets on it. Why does that matter? Well, if the more leaflets you have, the more foliage you have, the more photosynthesis, the bigger, nicer rose you're going to get. Sometimes roses will produce leaves with 7 leaflets. That's fine. Cut back to a 7 leaflet if there's one there, and then you'll get most of the time new buds with 7 leaflets. Again, the more foliage, the more photosynthesis, the more roses. Our modern roses, there's basically 4 areas or 4 types of modern roses. We're concentrating on just hybrid teas today, but we also have grandifloras, which are similar to hybrid teas that has long stems, but instead of producing one nice, large, perfect rose at the top, it'll produce a cluster of flowers. Then we have the floribundas, which are about half the height, a little bushier than the hybrid teas, and it produces flowers in large clusters. And then we have the miniature rose, which is about half again, smaller than the floribundas, or even smaller, and they produce usually flowers in multiples of 2, 3, or 4. When you prune your hybrid tea roses, it depends on the type, but we're going to look at hybrid teas. You want to prune these back to 8 to 12 inches above the ground. Generally, that's going to be between Thanksgiving and Christmas, whenever we've had enough cold weather to send these back into dormancy. You don't want to wait until spring to trim these back because a lot of these are tall and they shake a lot in the wintertime and they can loosen themselves in the ground, and that's not a good thing. So just go ahead and trim them back in the fall and cover over that bud union, and you'll be set for spring. After you prune them back to 8 to 12 inches, you can see the cuts there. If you can, trim them back to an outward facing bud. That's not going to be a huge thing because a lot of times these are going to die back a few more inches on those stems, and you're probably going to come back and make a new cut in the spring anyway. If it's a really large shrub and has a lot of canes on it, you may want to even trim some of those smaller canes completely out all the way down to the bud union, or just above the bud union if they're small and you got a lot of large ones. This is just a graphic to show you a full-size rose bush that's been put into dormancy, and then what it should look like after you prune it back in the fall. So kind of looks more like the rose that you're going to get, the bare root one, when it's already been trimmed back to where it needs to be. Winter care is very important for hybrid tea roses. You want to make sure you cover over that bud union. You can use soil, you can use mulch, any kind of organic material you like. Straw works, whatever you like. I like to go ahead and use the mulch that I'm going to put in the bed. So I'll just pile 6 or 8 inches of mulch over that bud union, and then in the spring all I have to do is rake that mulch down, and my bed's been mulched for the growing season as well. And you just kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone there. Some areas will tie the roses up like you see in that top photo. It's not necessary in our area, but if you like it that look, you can. I don't see any reason really to do it that way. Some popular hybrid teas for your garden. There's Peace. That's the one I talked about earlier. It's one of the most popular roses in the world. It still is today for growers. It has nice foliage. It has nice flowers. It's prolific. It's semi-disease resistant. It smells really nice. It's just an all-around good hybrid tea rose for your garden. Next is Double Delight there. It always reminds me of like a cherry parfait or something. But one thing about that Double Delight, it blooms a lot, produces large flowers, and it has more of a really strong lemony scent. It's one of those that you will not walk by the garden and not stop and smell it. Then we have Mr. Lincoln. That's probably one of the most popular home garden red roses. It produces long stem roses. It gets quite tall. I've seen it go 7 feet in one season. But it has a little disease resistance as well. And it's another one of those that the fragrance is heavenly. It's one of those, if you like red roses, definitely want to put that in your garden. And then we have Good as Gold, which is a yellow rose. It's been on the market maybe 25 years or so. It's not a real old rose, but it's a really nice rose. It's nice glossy foliage, and it produces that more of a flattened rose than some of the other ones, but it's a really nice rose as well. There's New Zealand. If you like a nice pink rose, that's a great one. And you can see in that photo how dark green the foliage is on that one. It has a nice fragrance as well. If you like the two-toned roses, there's Rio Samba, which instead of having the kind of the red and pink contrast to the white, it's contrasted to the yellow. Another one of those has a really nice fragrance as well and good disease resistance. Tropicana is another one of those roses that does great in our area. It is disease resistant. It grows quite large. It's another one of those. I've seen it go over 7 feet in one season. And it's had the thing about Tropicana that I really like is that it holds up well in the heat. It grows well in the heat of the summer. It's probably the reason it got its name Tropicana because it can take some of that hot weather and keep blooming for us. Then we have Fragrant Cloud, which you can see how it got its name because it's very fragrant. That's how come it's called Fragrant Cloud. But it's another one of those that's really nice, and you'll see it in a lot of garden centers. Pope John Paul II. It's not been out very long, but it's a nice white rose, pure white. Holds up well to heat and to drought. If you like white roses, definitely want to put that one in your garden. And then Tiffany is a nice pink rose. Grown that one for years. It blooms consistently. It has every 6 weeks goes a flush of blooms. It's another one of those that you can find pretty often in the garden centers or the big box stores as a bagged rose, fairly cheap. But it is a nice one that you definitely, if you like a light pink rose, you might want to put that one in your garden too. All right, so you're getting 2 roses for the class today. You're gonna get Midas Touch here, which is a pure yellow rose with almost a dark, deep forest green foliage. It has a good disease-resistant package. It produces nice 4 to 5 inch yellow flowers. It's just a good all-around rose. Not been around that long compared to a lot of other roses, but it is a great rose to have in your garden. And the second rose you get, it's called Big Purple. It's another one of those big roses. It has huge blooms of grape juice purple color. Has flowers 5 to 7 inches, and yes, it will produce 7-inch flowers, especially in the spring. Very fragrant, has a very strong, sweet fragrance, and it has really good hardiness. So you have a low chance of it freezing out in the winter, but you still want to make sure that you cover that bud union in the fall to get it through the winter. Well, that brings us to the end of the Hybrid Tea Rose class. Please come and pick up your plants if you've signed up. If you have any questions, you can leave questions in the comment sections. You can hit Facebook question me on our Washington County Facebook page. You can also send emails. You can also still call because we're still at the office. I will upload these videos to our YouTube channel, and that way you can always refer back to that if you need to. Happy gardening!